Thanks very much for having me over. My first time in Portugal, first time in Lisbon, which is pretty cool. Thank you, Pipedrive, for hosting us, and UX Lisbon for inviting me to join. Thanks to the previous speakers. I think they did a great job of introducing and talking about this topic from very different perspectives. And it's interesting to see the work that's being done everywhere else. Um, I will warn you that I get very excited about talking about this. And when I get very excited about talking about this, I speak very quickly. And so you have permission to tell me to slow down, right? You just put your hand up and be like, chill, bro, and I'll slow down. But this is a thing that can happen. And I understand that English may not be the first language for everybody. So if I speak really, really fast, so I found this, I was in an Uber and my driver was just talking really, really quickly. And I was like, I have no idea what you're saying. I know a few words, but when you speak that quickly, I can't get it. So please tell me to slow down if I go to work, right? Um, so 2 years ago, there was a funeral for a gentleman called Hugh Masekela. He's a jazz musician. This happened in Johannesburg, in South Africa. And at the funeral, people were singing and dancing. It didn't feel like a funeral. They were celebrating the life of this gentleman. He's kind of a hero to me, and I want to talk a bit about why that is. So Hugh grew up in. Am I correct right there? Yeah. So Hugh grew up in South Africa, and growing up, he was a bit of a troublemaker. But one of his teachers figured out that he loved music, and so he found him a trumpet, and Hugh started playing in a jazz band at the school. And he fell in love with jazz. He wanted to know everything about it. He wanted to always be listening, trying to play what he was hearing on the radio. He wanted to know about the musicians, and he wanted to be like them. So at the time, the best jazz musicians of the time they were probably in New York, people like Max Roach and Thelonious Monk. And so he was trying to figure out how can he get in touch with these people and hang out with them. One of the things that he did was find this movie called The Man with the Horn, which Kirk Douglas was in. And in it, Kirk Douglas plays a guy who's kind of playing the trumpet here, as you might see. But Kirk Douglas also got all the ladies. So he was like, yes, I definitely want to be a trumpeter and I want to get all the ladies. This is the kind of person that I want to be like growing up. Somehow, one of his teachers did manage to get in touch with an eminent jazz musician of the time, a man called Dizzy Gillespie. And they managed to write to Dizzy Gillespie. There was no Twitter, there was no internet. I don't know how they got his details, but nevertheless, they reached out to him. They told him, Dizzy, there's this guy who loves playing music. He's been trying to play the kind of things that you've been playing. And so what happened was Dizzy was, he was excited about this idea that there is this young teenager over in South Africa, in Johannesburg, who's playing jazz music, and he sent him his very own trumpet. And so this is Hugh receiving Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet, and he was very excited about it. Not only did he love jazz music, but it turned out that jazz music loved him back a bit, right? At the time, if you were listening to jazz, it may have sounded a bit like this. That sound is swing. So that was the most popular form of jazz music at the time. It was the most popular form of music in most instances. If you were going out to a party, going out clubbing on a Friday night in New York, that's probably what you were listening to. It was played by a big band and it was played live. But the challenge was that the artists were unhappy because they only were allowed to make the music that made money. Commercial artists end up in this situation, and they wanted to explore different avenues that may not have been commercially viable, but were interesting to them as artists. And so what they did in between sessions was they started to practice and started doing new things. So what's different between those two things, mostly, is that the first swing is kind of, you can dance to that, and it was made for that. It was made for parties. The second type of jazz, called bebop, is much faster, and it's got lots of complex chord changes and rhythms, and it's less about you having a good time dancing to the music, and it's more about the musicians exploring expression. And they would have solos where the trumpet player would do something, the bass player would do something, and all those things. It was music for musicians. You had to have an educated ear to be able to appreciate it. And that's what it kind of transitioned into, right? And again, Hugh was hearing this from across in South Africa, and he was, in love with what was going on. So during his lifetime, so at the time he was in South Africa, there was apartheid. So apartheid meant that black people and white people couldn't live in the same areas. They couldn't have the same access to opportunity. One instance, there was a curfew that was instituted, which meant that black people were not allowed to be seen in groups of 10 people or more at any one time, or you would all be arrested. He was a jazz musician, so that meant that you couldn't perform in a group like this. And he wanted to build his career. He was also affiliated with the political party that was there at the time, which made him a target for the police. And so he ended up having to leave South Africa, and he went to the UK. And in the UK, he was in exile, and he wanted to pursue jazz music, to listen to it and to learn more. But I don't know, James, if you can attest to this, but I don't know if there's much jazz going on in London and the UK in general. Yeah, right. So nevertheless, he couldn't kind of further his education. The thing that was happening is, can I move? Is that buzzing? Is that okay? Cool. What happened was a friend of his who was in New York at the time, his ex-girlfriend actually called him and she said, listen, if you want to be in the middle of where jazz music is, you need to come over here to New York. And he was like, cool. She bought him a ticket. He flew over. On the day that he arrives in New York, Dizzy Gillespie somehow finds out that he was coming to New York. Dizzy Gillespie calls him up and he's like, we're going clubbing tonight. Again, there was no Twitter, there was no Instagram, but somehow you figured it out. You called them, they got together. They went out clubbing that night. So Dizzy Gillespie is one of the main people in this jazz movement. Calls you, and in that night, they went to all the top jazz spots, stayed up all night. And Hugh Masekela was introduced to all of his music heroes, people like Thelonious Monk, people like Max Roach that he had only been hearing on the radio, people he was trying to be like. All of a sudden, he was in the middle of these people, meeting them, and maybe even got a chance to play with them all in that one night. This was an amazing thing. I can imagine that maybe for us today, they'll be following each other on Twitter, on Instagram. Maybe he would have joined their Slack group or something like that. I don't know. But this was an amazing thing for him, coming from, from very far to being in the middle of what was going on. The big thing that you wanted to do as a jazz musician at that time was you wanted to join a band. You wanted to be in one of the bands like the one I just showed you. And Hugh tried for all his life to try and get to play with one of these folks. And he was good enough. He managed to get some sessions with them. He was playing on some of their records. But he wasn't a permanent member of a group. And he kept trying to pursue this until he met this gentleman, Miles Davis, one of the coolest jazz cats to ever exist. And Miles Davis was like, Hugh, what's wrong with you? How is it possible that you've come from thousands of kilometers from across the world and you want to be just like us? Don't you recognize that where you come from and what you know is a source of heritage? Being on the outside is important. The perspective that you bring is critical. You know about rhythms and perspectives of music that we have never known and we could never learn. Why don't you think about that and put it together with the other things that are going on here? And we can make something transcendent. You can make something that moves jazz music forward. You can bring something that we can learn that's new that we could never have known because of who you are, where you come from. Well, at least this is what Hugh Masekela heard. What Miles Davis actually said was, take your shit from home, put that with the shit you learn here, and that's going to be a motherfucker, right? But this changed Hugh's life. He essentially changed his direction and he understood that, what I know is something that these folks will never know without me showing them. And so he started revisiting the lullabies, the love songs, the war songs that would be sung in his native Africa where he was from. And he started combining those with the jazz techniques that he was learning in New York, and he created a new Afro jazz fusion sound. And I think at his funeral, this is what they were celebrating. They were celebrating the idea that he managed to bring his own heritage, his own culture, his outside perspective to a new place and combine those things to create something new. And for me, this is why Hugh Masekela is a hero. Now, where you work, and we've heard some of this from the folks at Pipedrive, we talk a lot about diversity. We want to work with people who are not like us, who don't look like us, people with different perspectives than us, people who are differently able than us, people with different beliefs. Why? So that we can extend the range of what we believe to be normal. Right now, what we believe to be normal is very narrow. The world is very broad. And we need to bring people with different perspectives to change how we think about the products that we make, the processes we use to make those products, the companies that we build. Right? We want to change all that and expand it to include more and more people. And to do that, we need to be thinking differently. Right? We need people who don't think like us. And this is fantastic. It's actually been proven by a gentleman called Scott Brigg that when you have teams that are made up of diverse people, that team is more likely to come up with new and innovative ideas. That team is more resilient and more adaptive to change. This mathematical formula explains the wisdom of crowds, right? So what does it mean when I can make a guess about a certain situation versus when this whole group can make a guess about that situation. The likelihood that the group will get it right more often than I will just because of my own view. And that's what this mathematics talks about. This different perspective, the meanings, attitudes, values, this comes from the culture that we live in, right? You don't just have a perspective by itself, but rather your perspectives comes from the culture that you grow in. This culture also has different practices. How do you celebrate? How do you have communication? All of these things will be different, right? And this is the thing that I think we forget when we talk about diversity, is that we want to bring the different perspective, how you think. We want to see that in the work that you're doing, but we maybe think less about what kind of person you are when you are thinking different, and how do we put those things together. Our assumption is if you've got a great portfolio and you are diverse, we're going to hire you, you're going to join the team, and everything's going to be fantastic with this team that's made up of different people, right? And I think this is where there's a bit of breakage. I think that we can afford to think about the challenges that come up when people from different cultures work together. I had an experience of this in my first job. I was in the UK. I was there for about 10 years. I was working on a project. It wasn't, I was leading the project for the first time in my life, having a direct relationship with the client. And the project wasn't working out. But I kept waiting for the right moment to talk to my boss and explain that, look, something is wrong. This thing isn't working. And for some reason, I couldn't have that direct conversation with him. And eventually the client called my boss, tells him that, do you know that this project is going off the rails? My boss is like, no, I didn't know. He puts down the phone. He pulls me aside. He's like, what's going on? 3 days later, he calls me into the office and he's like, Farai, you didn't do enough. We're going to have to let you go. I was 22 and I just been fired from my first job. I knew exactly what I'd done wrong. I knew what I needed to do, but somehow I couldn't have those conversations that I needed to have with my boss. A few weeks later, I was reading a Malcolm Gladwell book called Outliers, in which he talks about Korean Airlines. And in Korean Airlines, they had a spate of crashes. What was happening was that, so between 1970 something and the 1990s, they lost about 700 lives. Absolutely crazy for an airline. That should not happen. Why was this happening? So they listened to the black box recordings, and what they hear is that the pilots can't talk to each other properly. In one particular instance, there was an airplane that was flying through a storm, and they couldn't see with their eyes, and they were relying on instruments. And as they're doing this thing, you can hear the co-pilot saying, oh, this storm is very bad. We can't really see, can we do something about this? The co-pilot was being very soft about what was going on. The pilot wasn't responding because of this soft conversation. And in the end, they crashed into the side of a mountain. When the investigators were listening to these tapes, they started to see this trend. They were like, what's going on? It turns out that in Korea, they have what they call a high power distance index. What this means is that when someone is working with someone who is their boss, they see that person almost as godlike. And so their ability to have a direct conversation with that person is minimized. In some instances, that relationship was so bad that the co-pilot used to carry the pilot's bag to the airplane when they were going to fly. Not because it was his buddy and he was doing him a favor, but they weren't peers, right? One was superior and one was definitely inferior. And so what this meant was that in the airplane, when the pilot was making a mistake, the co-pilots couldn't call the pilot out on it, right? And so they ended up in this situation. When I read about this, I thought this sounded kind of familiar. I didn't want to make an excuse for my failure, for the fact that I kind of been fired, but I started to understand that there are things about my culture that were showing up at work that I didn't know about. I wasn't thinking, I literally had no idea that there was something about where I grew up that can influence how I show up at work. And this is what I mean when I talk about culture appearing as a bias in the work that we do. We bring the diverse teams and we bring the diverse perspectives, but we also bring diverse cultures, which we might not be aware of, that can result in clashes that mean that as much as we've got brilliant people with great portfolios working together, we might not be able to actually work efficiently or effectively, and we might not deliver the product or the innovation that we expect to deliver. Gerrit Hofstadter is a man who defined this thing called power distance index. He's a Dutch professor. And he defined, so the power distance index I spoke about, he defined that. He defined a bunch of other things, individualism, the tendency for nurturing or power seeking, uncertainty, long-term orientation. I looked at these things and I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I could learn more about this in my culture. But it wasn't really helpful for my work. I couldn't understand, how do I translate these into the work that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, right? That's when I came across the work of Dr. Erin Meyer. And she's a principal at INSEAD Business School, which is just outside Paris. And she had her own scale similar to his. And she writes about it in this book called Culture Map, which you all should get, you all should read. But she talks then about, deciding, I got too far. She talks about these other things that you do. So deciding, persuading, communicating, disagreeing, evaluating, leading, trusting, scheduling. These are things that we do on a day-to-day basis at work. And she talks about how culture can influence how each of us do these different things based on the cultures that we grew up in, the cultures we were educated in, and the cultures that we ultimately end up working in or that our companies kind of form. So when it comes to deciding what might happen, so there are some cultures where there is what is called consensual decision making. We must all agree so that we can move forward. And in other cultures, there is top-down decision making. The boss decides, we have to get on with it, right? Neither of these is better or worse. I had an experience of this where I was working in South Africa, there was a day that we launched one of our products. We launched it on the tablet app. As soon as we launched this, the CEO announces, and we're also going to have the phone version up in 90 days. And the media obviously were happy about this, but the rest of us who were working on that team weren't, because we hadn't been consulted. And the first time we heard about that was on the TV, right? So what that meant was when we went back to work, we had to figure out how to land this app in 90 days. The top-down decision had been made. But what was difficult for us was not just that we had to do the design and engineering, we also had to convince everybody else in the company to get with the program, because they had also only heard about it at that time. If you contrast that with what they might do in Japan, which is called ringishi, where if a big decision like that is going to be made, lower level people will discuss the opportunity and say, can we do this in 90 days? They will then write a paper on this that will go to middle management, to senior management. By the time the head boss says we're doing this thing, everyone in the company has heard about it. Everybody may not agree, but they know what we're committed to and what we want to do. So that on the day that they announce it and they want to go, everybody's there and everybody can get on with the work. And we just need to focus on design and engineering, not design engineering and also getting the organization together. So that's to say, consensual or top-down isn't wrong or right. But what's important to understand is, what do we as a team, what do we as a company value? How are we going to make a decision? When everybody knows that, then there's less opportunity for conflict in getting what we need to get done, right? So agree on how you want to make that decision as a team. I was going to talk about persuading, but that's a bit boring. These slides can be made available and you can share them out and you can have a look at them. But I want to get on because I realize that so when it comes to communicating, there is what is called low context cultures and there are what are called high context cultures. What does this mean? I'll give you an example. So when I was, I grew up in Zimbabwe till I was 18. I left for about 7 years. And when I came back to South Africa, or when I went back to Zimbabwe, I went to visit one of my uncles, and a friend of mine gave me a lift and dropped me off there. It was cool. I arrived. When I get there, my uncle asks me in Shona, which is my native language, he says, "Wawiya wega," which means, "Did you come here by yourself?" And I was like, no, my friend dropped me off, and so, that's how I got here. And my uncle's like, "Wawiya wega." He emphasizes more. And I'm like, "I just told you, I got a lift. That's how I got here. Someone dropped me off." Then he asks me a third time, "Wawiya wega." So I'm now confused, and I look to my aunt, and I'm like, "Yo, can you translate? I haven't forgotten the language or anything. I still know what's going on. What is he saying?" And my aunt says to me, "What your uncle means is, did you bring a wife?" I'm like, "The fuck? How did we even get to that point?" Right? So what my uncle was doing was using high context communication. What he was saying was, we are both from the same culture. You left here when you were a child. You now have a job. You're of marrying age. You have a beard. We expect you to bring back, a wife. We expect you to be married. And you should know this if I say, "Wawiya wega," did you come here by yourself? Right? That's an example of high context communication, where there is an assumption that you know what's going on, and I just have to say a few things, and that should trigger off a whole essay, whole paragraphs that weren't being said that you should have understood. Contrast that with low context communication, where we assume that between us we know nothing. If you go to training to give presentations, you might hear somebody say something like, "Okay, here's how you give a good presentation. First of all, tell the people what you're about to tell them. Introduce the presentation. Then you give the actual presentation, right? When you're finished, remind everybody what you just told them." Repetition. Repetition is great in low context. Why is that important? Because we can make no mistakes. No one will be confused about what happened. So when we work in cross-cultural teams, low context is the recommendation, because it means that everybody knows what's going on. If you just were on a Zoom call and you had a conversation about a thing, Somebody needs to write an email, summarize exactly what we discussed, and make sure that's written out so that everybody is clear on what happened, right? And those are the differences and the things we might accommodate for when we're trying to communicate across cultures. When it comes to disagreeing, there are cultures where confrontation is okay, and we can have those conversations, and other cultures where we might avoid confrontation. An example is I have someone who I used to work with came from Burundi. They joined an engineering team in North America. And during one of their one-on-ones, the lead said, "Listen, your code is great, but I hate the fact that you always say yes to everything I ask you to do." And so she's like, "Okay, hold up. My code is great. I said yes to the things you want me to do. What the problem is, right?" And ultimately, what the boss was saying was, the best way for you to bring your perspective to this organization is to question the things that we ask you to do. Not because you want to be stubborn, but because you bring a new perspective. And when you question what we are asking you to do, you cause us to reflect on what we want to do, right? And so that confrontation, that conversation is going to help us to, at the very least, take advantage of your perspective and try and build a better product, build a better team. What she was thinking was, coming from a culture that avoids confrontation, she was thinking, if I question my boss, I'm going to lose my job, right? So the cultures were very different there. So what the lead then did was to create a situation where they could role play. They could pretend to have these confrontational conversations until she started to understand that you can have a confrontation without it resulting in a breakdown in the relationship. You can have a confrontation and keep your job, right? And that's a good thing. In German, they have this word called Sachlichkeit, which means that we can argue the thing about the thing without arguing people. We can have a very loud conversation about something that we don't agree about, and we can walk out of that conversation as friends because we talk about the thing, not about each other. Whereas if you're doing this in North America, there's a strong likelihood that if you argue with somebody about something that they've done, they will walk away thinking that it's a personal conversation, and you're saying that they're a bad person, or they're a bad design, right? The important thing is to be able to understand, how do we have objective conversations across culture? When it comes to giving feedback, there are cultures where direct negative feedback is great, and others where you don't want to give direct negative feedback because it will break group harmony. So imagine that you've got a team in Nigeria working with a team in the UK. The UK team presents to the Nigerians. The Nigerians are looking at the work, remote call on Zoom. They put up the Envision prototype, and the Nigerians are like, "This is absolutely the wrong thing, right? You entirely missed the brief, and there is no way that we're going to ship this product with those kinds of interactions that you're going to design. So please review these things. Let's talk again on Friday and see if we're going to ship this to the client," right? The UK people are going to be like, "Whoa, what did we just do? Is this personal?" Right? Those people are douches. We don't want to work with them again, right? And they may not even tell the Nigerians directly that they're unhappy with that. Let's flip that around. Let's have the Nigerians present it to the British. The British might be like, "Thanks very much, folks. It looks like we're getting there. It looks like we're getting really, really close. Just a few things that you might want to think about, and we're going to describe those things, and you might want to have a look at some of those interactions on that login form. They might need a bit of tweaking if you have some time, but otherwise, thanks very much for your efforts. It's looking good." The Nigerians will get off the call and be like, "We killed it," right? Everybody's equally unhappy, but they're very different interpretations of that feedback, right? And so being able to be direct or indirect is something that we have to normalize. We have to understand, what are the different cultures, where they're coming from, right? So what you need to do is to skill up on the critique method that you want your team to use, because critique is a skill. It is not an innate thing. Just because I can design a new sketch doesn't mean I can talk about design effectively. Skill up. Put everybody on a level. It's not just a design skill. Everyone in the organization needs the feedback. Whether it's a code review, we're reviewing a product brief, we all want to be able to be better at doing this thing, right? At Shopify, when I started joining, when you onboard in your first days, they literally skill you up on either radical candor or discussing design. You learn about how to talk about this thing, because what they say is, you're not just here to make the product, you're also here to improve the company, which means that we need to be able to critique everything that we're doing, and we need to be able to discuss those things in a productive way. Leading, I spoke about a little bit, right? So leading is the challenge that I faced when I was in the UK, where my relationship with the people who were leading me, I expected deep hierarchy. That's what I knew from my culture. When I was working there, my boss would crash on my sofa after a night out. It was very flat. It was alien to me. And so my natural instinct was to recreate the hierarchy in my own mind, even though the organization was flat. In my culture, my expectation was that we needed to have this level, and I was creating false barriers between us. What was important is for us to maybe normalize and have a conversation about, listen, we have a flat structure here. And the reason why we value flat structure is this. If you have any challenges with that, we can discuss that. Conversely, if you work in an organization that has deep hierarchy, there might be a very good reason for that. And so we should discuss, why do we have all these levels of management? And how do we work with all those levels of management, right? As long as everyone in the group has understood why things work and how things work, we can avoid the clashes that can happen across these different cultures. When it comes to building trust, there are two kinds of ways of building trust. There's task-based trust. What this means is, if you're great at your job, and you'll find this mostly in North America, if you're great at your job, we trust you because you're great at your job. That's all we need from you. You go over to the East, in places like China, we trust each other because we have a relationship, because we spend time together. I know about your family, you know about my family. That's why I trust you, right? You might be good at your job, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to do a deal with you, right? And so it's understanding, how do we build this trust? Dr. Erin Meyer here suggests, importantly, that breaking bread, eating together, is a way across cultures to kind of build, right? And this is important because it doesn't mean we're going out for drinks after work, because drinks are actually not very inclusive. If you think about people who are parents, people who are previous alcoholics, all those different things, they don't want to go to drinks, right? Have a team breakfast, have a team lunch, right? Sit with the team and eat together. And that's a great way to build trust across all those different cultures, right? When it comes to scheduling, when it comes to scheduling, there are different approaches here. There's linear time, where cultures like German culture, they have a plan. We must follow the plan from beginning to end. We don't deviate, right? And this is great because it means that the team can be predictable. If the project was supposed to ship in September, resources are available from then on and we can work on the next thing. We need to do this so we can plan for it. That's great. However, in other cultures, they value being flexible. Yes, we've got a plan, but if a new opportunity comes up, you'll see this a lot in India and in China. If something new comes up, we might want to explore that because that might be the next big thing. And we might want to divert our resources entirely so we can do this new thing because that's what's going to get us ahead. Again, it is not about whether one is better than the other, but it's about knowing that these different opportunities exist and deciding as a team what's important to us. Is it important to us for us to always start and finish the plan as we plan? Or is it important to us to be flexible and to be able to change and switch between those things? So these are the 8 things that I had learned about from Erin Meyer. And they really helped me to think about, okay, so my culture, where I'm from, how can I think about how I can bring that to work to bear? Diversity is an important thing. Yes, we need people who are different shades of brown. We need to include folks who have different religious, gender, or able, and all these other differences. We must make sure that we are working with those people. We must include them in the work that we are doing to increase our value, our understanding of what normal is, right? But if you think that's all that is, then you might be making a mistake. You will see many team photos that all of a sudden have the token person, the one of a kind in them. That's optics. It looks great. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are actually changing what we are doing or how we are doing it, right? We have to find a situation where people can be included and they can feel as though they are part of what we are doing and they're able to lead and make decisions in our organizations, even if they're different than us, right? We can afford to learn from Hugh and Miles. We can afford to be more like Miles, who when he saw somebody who was different, who was forgetting their own difference, he pointed that out and he said, yo, think about where you're from and how you are. And can you bring some of that to our organization so that we can benefit? Can you bring that to our team, to our product, that we can make something better? Because culture hides more than it reveals. And strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. Like me, I didn't know that high power distance index was the thing that affected me. It's like the air, it's around me. I don't know that it's there. I'm just breathing and it's part of my life, right? Culture does the same thing. We don't know that we are doing things because of culture. We just are who we are. Sometimes it needs to be pointed out to us. We can also afford to be like you, who, when he was told, he understood that he needed to look back to where he was from and to harness his perspective, to harness being an outsider and to bring that to bear in the work that he was doing at that time. When we do this, when we know our shit, and we put that with the shit that we learn wherever we go, that's going to be a motherfucker.